Thank you, David. Hello once again, folks. My name is Randy Campbell. For the 38th consecutive year, I'm privileged to be head of the Fund Education Committee. And over that 38-year span, we've had some absolutely amazing, terrific speakers, and Ray Herz is clearly one of those. Ray has spoken on a wide range of subjects, including standing Liberty quarters, commemorative coins, and all sorts of just neat stuff, including a tour of Philadelphia. So those of you who know him really well know that he gives outstanding speeches. He's one of these researchers and collectors who believes in sharing his knowledge with his fellow collectors. And I think people who do that are just wonderful people, and they help make coin collecting what it really is. Today, we're going to take a step back in history, if you will. The Coinage Act of 1965 was one of the most important pieces of legislation that was ever passed by our federal government, especially if you're interested in numismatics. And Ray's going to tell you why it's important, what happened as a result of it, and all sorts of interesting aspects that were the side effects or after effects, if you will, of the passage of this law. So it's a really important thing for those of you who are coin history buffs, and most of us are. Ray has been from the area of Jacksonville for quite some time and is an active member of the Jacksonville Coin Club, and has lectured here at the Fund Show for approximately 10 years, Ray? More than that, perhaps?
More than that now.
More than that. He's a guy we can count on to give us just a terrific speech, and you're going to get a terrific speech today. It's my pleasure on behalf of Fund to introduce to you Mr. Ray Herz.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray.
Can we get these front lights? I'll wait till our videographer is back in place. Okay. Well, any of you have ever seen one of my presentations, my opening slide is typically an appearing montage of things coming in that gives you a hint of what I'm going to talk about. But this time, it's a little different. This is a disappearing montage of things going away. And this reflects what was happening in the early 1960s when silver coinage was leaving circulation at a phenomenal rate. It created the worst coinage crisis in a century, since the 1860s and 70s, when all coinage couldn't circulate until the silver strikes of the mid to late 1870s, and then coins flooded back into circulation. So what had to be done? What had to alleviate this crisis? And what was the result was the most sweeping legislation in 172 years since the Treasury was established and our coinage system was established. So it's the Coinage Act of 1965, a 50-year retrospective. And just let you know, unless otherwise notified, none of the photos are mine. I have no compunction about stealing good photos from the internet. And so the vast majority from heritage auctions. So what this is going to talk about in two major parts. First are, what are the events that led up to the Act? What were some of its major provisions and its immediate after effects on U.S. coinage? And then in part two, we're going to look at some of the changes wrought to U.S. coins over the last 50 years, denomination by denomination, so we'll be going from dollars to cents. So some of the events that led up to that, the price of silver was rising. That's, of course, the number one thing. And this graph shows from about 1930 to 1963. Okay, and just to give you an idea, in the depths of the Depression in 1932, silver was 25 cents an ounce. If you go forward in the 1950s, it was hanging around the 80s, something like that. And then in 1961, it broke above the dollar barrier. So this is the effects of wash and quarter mintage. So that's the prior chart, the effects of silver on the mintage. And you can see where we had major recessions and depressions that bottomed out coinage mintages over those 3 decades. So the things that were causing silver to rise was industrial demand, mostly in the early electronics age with computers and transistors and whatnot. The industrial demand was just about outstripping the coinage demand, but what was the new silver being mined was way behind either one. So when silver hit $1 an ounce in 1961, the public started hoarding. Okay, the public thought that $1's worth of silver coins had $1's worth of silver. But there's a little thing called seigniorage. Anybody know what seigniorage is? Okay, and we'll be talking about a lot about that. Seigniorage is the profit over face value. In other words, taking the cost of materials and die making and everything else, seigniorage is the profit over the cost to produce coinage. So in actuality, a dollar's worth of dimes, quarters, or halves, when silver is $1, has only 72 ounces, 0.72 ounces of silver. Okay. Now with silver dollars, it was slightly higher. Of course, they hadn't been minted since the 1930s. The Coinage Act of 1873 set their bullion amount higher, 0.77 ounces per dollar. So in actuality, to reach 1 ounce of silver using silver dollars, you need $1.29 in silver dollars and $1.38 in dimes, quarters, or halves. So silver reached $1.29, just about the break-even point on September 1st, 1963. So this is another thing. The Treasury was redeeming tens of millions of silver dollars for silver certificates. So the minimum you could come in with was like $10 worth. So if you got $10 or more in silver certificates, you got 10 silver dollars. And if you had 100, you got 100. So by the time the Treasury halted this exchange in March of 1964, the original hoard of 100 million was down to 3 million. And if a lot of you remember, the last of that 3 million was sold in the 1970s as the GSA hoard. This is what the lines looked like outside the New York Assets Office on the last day they offered any kind of silver. After they stopped redeeming silver dollars, they had silver bullion. So you would get, for $100, 72 ounces or thereabouts in a silver bar. And if it was a little bit, you get like silver granules. Of course, none of these were as popular as the silver dollars. Now, the Treasury might have made better use, just speculating here, by smelting those $100 million and recoining them as dimes and quarters. And the precedent, of course, was the Pittman Act of 1918, where hundreds of millions of Morgan dollars were melted and recoined as peace dollars in the 1920s. So if you had $100 million, you could have done 1.69 billion dimes and 267 million quarters, and these are the 1963 mintages. So in either case, you would have gained an extra year of silver without having to go out and get new silver. Of course, we would have never known about the GSA hoard. We would have never known, what were those $100 million. In fact, 97 of the 100 million, we have no idea what they were, if they were rare, common, whatever, most likely common. So it was getting very heated, and the Mint had to come up with something. So in 1963, the Treasury Department hired the Patel Memorial Institute to come up with replacement materials. Now, Patel is a nonprofit think tank. Among the other things they came up was the barcodes, universal pricing, which affects everything that everybody buys. So they've had a lot of great ideas over the year. So they eventually experimented with 17 metals in dozens of combinations. And a number of patterns saw the light of day over the next 2 years. This is one, a pattern quarter dollar produced by the US Mint. So they used like a funky die that didn't look anything like a regular coin. And this is one by International Nickel Company. Gilroy Roberts, the chief engraver, actually designed this. And the August Frank Company did this pattern, actually using an explosive decaclad, which is very close to the final material used for clad coinage. Another thing that exacerbated the situation was in March of 1964, the Kennedy half dollar was introduced. So our most popular coin of all time becomes a worldwide souvenir, and hundreds of millions were exported. This is the Mint. I'm just going to give you an idea here, perspective. If the Kennedy half dollar hadn't come about, the half dollar would have died a natural death probably by the end of the 1960s. And you can see mintages of Franklin halves, how low they are. In the mid-50s, it was only a couple million a year. Well, that's only $1 million a year, and the economy was way bigger than that. So when silver spiked, so did the mintages of the Franklin halves. Now, this is one of those graphs. If you imagine the size of the Earth versus Jupiter, this is in scale the 1964 dated mintage of 1964 halves. Okay, 429 million. That's the average series vintage per year of Franklin halves. Now, if I take out the last 3 years when the mintage spiked, that is the average for the first 13 years, compared to the number of Kennedys minted. Of course, none of these coins are rare. So the Kennedy half-dollar hoarding was so intense that the half-dollar ceased forever to be a circulating coin. So legislation was also enacted in August of 1964, authorizing the coinage of 45 million silver dollars. Why? Why? Vast numbers of peace and Morgan dollars have already been melted and exchanged and given away, and they had set unused in treasury vaults for 30 to 80 years. And as I mentioned, the number that were melted and redeemed. So the dollar had never been a successful coin. In fact, the Coinage Act of 1873 did away with the dollar. That was the end of the seeded dollars. So it's only because we had these huge silver strikes in the 1870s that we had the Bland-Allison Act, which created the Morgan dollar, which still never circulated. So in early 1965, 316,000 peace dollars were minted. None ever saw the light of day. It's almost become an urban myth, because not even one of these was given to the Smithsonian Institution, our national coin collection. So not a one of these exists anywhere. So 1 month after the legislation authorizing those silver dollars, President Johnson signs a bill freezing the 1964 date on all coinage, not just the silver coinage. This also affected pennies and nickels, which weren't subject so much to the huge hoarding. So the numismatic community lobbied the Secretary of Treasury, and everybody says, we're not the ones doing this. We don't have enough money to affect the entire U.S. economy. And when I talk about market capitalization, at the time, you take every single sale of every single coin during a year, okay, that is the market capitalization. These days, the market capitalization per year is in the many hundreds of millions. Not so, obviously, then. And so, what was the net effect of this act on freezing the date by hoarding on by the general public? Zero. The public still hoarded, they didn't care. So the stage is set. On February 12, 1965, Patel delivers its report to the Treasury Department, and the recommendation is to replace silver dimes and quarters with a clad copper nickel coins, and the exact mix was to be formulated after consultation with the vending industry, because these coins had to have the same electrical properties as silver coins, so they could be used in vending machines simultaneously. Now, because of the strong sentiment on Kennedy, and because the silver industry was still pushing, the Kennedy half got a slight break. It would be 40% silver, a compromise. On June 3rd, 1965, President Johnson asked Congress to authorize the law. This is the Coinage Act of 1965. Compare this to Obamacare and recent legislation that's bigger than any telephone book. This is only about 4 pages long. This is actually most of the act in a couple short pages. So this, I want you to see, this is what Johnson said when he signed the act in August of 1965. Now note the part in blue. You don't have to worry so much about the top. It says, we estimate there are now 12 billion, I repeat, more than 12 billion silver dimes, quarters, and halves that are now outstanding. And we will keep making them as long as necessary, even if we have to add another billion. And he wasn't far off on either one of those numbers, except they weren't going to last long regardless. So here's some of the major provisions. The diameter and thickness of the coins will remain unchanged. The half-dollar shall consist of an outer layer of 80% silver, 20% copper, with a core, as you can see, with a kind of a mixed bag. The total weight of the half was 1 gram less than prior silver coins. The diamond quarters shall consist of layers of 75% copper and 25% nickel with a pure copper core. The total weight of the quarters slightly reduced. Total weight of the dime is slightly reduced. 90% silver coinage will maybe continue to be minted until sufficient supplies of clad coinage are available for circulation. No standard silver dollars would be produced for 5 years from the enactment of the act. Of course, standard silver dollars would never be produced again, but this was negating the prior act in August of '64 that authorized those silver dollars. All coins and currencies of the United States shall become legal tender. In order to procure equipment, material, labor, whatever is necessary, the Secretary of the Treasury may enter into contracts without competitive bidding. That's what that meant. So normally the government is required to get competitive bids on contracts. Because of this emergency, that was suspended, but not to exceed 5 years. It authorized the silver at the artificially arbitrary rate of $1.25, authorized the ban of melting or exporting U.S. coins at the discretion of the Secretary. What that means, it wasn't an immediate ban. It was up to the Secretary of Treasury if he would enact a ban. If the ban is enacted, any coin seized for export or melting is forfeit. So what also happened, to the chagrin of collectors, there were no mint marks on coins for 3 years. There were no proof sets for 3 years. Instead, we had these special mint sets for those 3 years. And S-mint proofs were introduced in 1968. On May 18, 1967, roughly a year and a half, the Treasury Department did enact a ban, and it was lifted almost exactly 2 years to the week in 1969. So by 1970, the Kennedy half had all but disappeared for circulation. The mint did not produce Kennedy halves for circulation in 1970. They were only made for proof and mint sets, so they became semi-keys of the series. In 1971, the mint introduced fully clad copper nickel halves for circulation with the reduced weight. And we'll talk about those a little bit later also. So the first coins were lighter. The quality was poor. The strikes were muddy. The public and collector disdained them. Not that they really had a choice as far as commerce went, but it was a good money driving out, bad money driving out good. This is a graph showing you what happened with the 1964 frozen coins. My first red book was the 1966 red book. It came out, just like red books do now, in the spring of the prior year. So it came out in the spring of 1965. It's got a secret. It is the only red book that tells you the mintage of 1964 dated coins in 1964. Okay, every subsequent red book has the complete mintages of 1964 dated coins, which is a far cry from the ones produced in 1964. So you can see 1964 dated dimes, quarters, and halves were produced until 1966. The halves were reduced to about April of 1966. Then the first clad coin to be produced was the quarters. They started production around August and were released around November. The dimes and halves started production in December and were released in March of 1966. So 1965 dated coins were produced until about August of 1966. The last few months of 1966 were the only production months for the 1966 coins. Then in 1967, we got back to normalcy where the coins were produced for the dated year. Now, when I talk about market capitalization, you can look at the very bottom. I picked the top 5 coins of 1965 and show their 1965 prices and the 2014 prices. Big difference in market capitalization for some of these rarities. And I want you also to know this line here, the line that says 14 billion. So Johnson wasn't far off. About 14 billion silver coins were swept away. So he wasn't far off because that included the 1964 dated coins. And about 14 billion clad coins were produced between 1965 and 1970. So it's a little interlude. What was the fate of the Las Vegas silver dollars? And what replaced them? During this time, silver dollars were leaving Las Vegas even faster than in general circulation because people always took them away as souvenirs. Now they were hoarding them like crazy. In 1964, Gilroy Roberts retired from the U.S. Mint, and a few months later co-founded the Franklin Mint with Joseph Siegel. Between 1965 and 1969, the Franklin Mint's largest project was production of silver, copper, nickel, 50-cent, dollar, and $5 gaming tokens. They eventually went to hundreds of casinos and hundreds of varieties. Over 267 different types were produced. The Franklin Mint and the casino industry made millions on these because they obviously cost a few cents per token, and they sold them to the casinos at less than the coin face value because they were just tokens. So Gilbert Roberts himself became a multimillionaire during the first 4 years of the Franklin Mint, but they stopped them after 1969. This is a few samples. The one in the upper right, the flamingo, was actually sculpted by Roberts. So this is now part two, some of the changes wrought to U.S. coins over the last 50 years. So starting with dollars in 1971, after a 36-year absence, the silver dollars are introduced with the Eisenhower dollar sculpted by Frank Aspero. The new dollars were that weight, a little bit lighter than obviously the silver dollars, about 4 grams lighter. In the first 2 years, production was about 285 million. Other than Las Vegas using these to replace the Franklin Mint tokens, they didn't circulate. In 1973, there was no circulating mintage. So basically, after 2 years, they basically gave up on these. So the verdict, epic fail. Now, there was a boon to collectors during the first 2 years because there was no clad proofs. Silver proofs were available in proof and uncirculated to collectors. And this is significant because this was the first time a commemorative version of a coin was produced for collectors in a material different from the circulating version. Okay, so this was the first time we had 40% dollars, and the coins were different from what was circulating. And these weighed about 24.5 grams. Collectors went for these big time, and 11 million were produced in the first year alone. Then in 1974, we had a competition for the bicentennial half, quarter, and dollar. And this was the first time since the late 1930s when we had the competition for the Jefferson nickel that the general public was invited to compete. The coins would be double dated 1976, and were to be produced in 1975 and 1976. The Liberty Bell design was done by Dennis R. Williams. 120 million circulation strikes were produced, but with so many of the earlier coins tying up the pipeline, nobody ever saw these in circulation. Between 77 and 78, another $72 million were produced for circulation, and after the bicentennial versions, no more 40% silver dollars would ever be produced. The total series mintage was 554 million. During the course of the Eisenhower years, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing printed about 16.5 billion $1 Federal Reserve notes. So you can see, even if these had circulated, they would have had little effect on the actual economy. And they had no effect, really. So in 1979, without taking a breather, another attempt was made at a dollar coin. This was the Susan B. Anthony dollar, aka the Carter quarter. Introduced in 1979, a whopping 658 million were produced in the first year, with 100 million more the second year, and then that was pretty much it. The coin weighed 26.5 millimeters compared to 24.3 for the quarter, and that confused the public quite a bit. So the production costs were about 8 cents, and had this been successful, the seigniorage would have been outstanding, 92 cents per unit. So why the public and collectors passively disdained the Ike dollar, they hated the SBA dollar. So the verdict, epic fail. So after another 89 million, almost 90 were produced in 1980, circulating production ceased, and only collector coins were produced in 1981. So the question is, if at all possible, had a decent looking bust of Susan B. Anthony been done, would it have helped? So this is a medal produced in the 1960s, and it's the same dress, but she's facing the opposite side of the coin, and I don't think it would have helped. So after nearly 2 decades, the Treasury reserves were running low, because the Ike dollar got replaced in the casinos with the Anthony dollar. So they produced another 21 million in 1999, even though they knew that the competition was on for the replacement coin. So 750,000 proofs were produced that year, and the collecting fraternity didn't seem to care. So that's the total mintage of business strike Anthony dollars. During the same time, that means the 1980, 81, 79, 80, and 1999, the BEP produced 13.6 billion $1 Federal Reserve notes. Is an interlude now. In 1987, Canada introduced a golden dollar called the loonie. It measured this almost the same as the SBA, but was 1 gram lighter. The loonies became a huge hit. 781 million were produced in the first 10 years. To put that in perspective, 706 million Canadian quarters were produced. So the dollar mintage outpaced the quarter mintage in Canada. It was huge. So put in further perspective, the U.S. produced 14.8 billion quarters at the same time. And the secret of the success, Canada stopped printing $1 notes in 1989. So they had no choice. And somehow we haven't paid attention to these lessons learned more than a quarter of a century ago. So in 1998, 99, we had, for the first time in a generation, open competition for a circulating coin. This is since the bicentennial coins. 120 submissions were produced, and with great grand fanfare, the winner was announced to the public on May 4. The obverse was designed by the leading sculptor in the country, Glenna Goodacre. I don't mean that lightly. Glenna Goodacre has designed a number of monuments, including the Reagan statue for the Reagan Library, the Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, a immigrant memorial in Philadelphia. She didn't need to do this coin. She didn't need it at all. And we ended up with an outstanding obverse. And for the first time in history, a Native American woman was actually shown on a U.S. coin. She was actually the model, even though it's sort of a conglomerate. So the numismatic community did greatly anticipate this coin. And this is the composition, and I'm not going to go through all that. A whopping 1.286 billion, we'll put that in perspective, that's 1.286 billion were produced in the first year, followed by 133 million, and then production was halted. And during these same fiscal years, the production of the Federal Reserve note was 13.875 billion. So what's the verdict? That's the verdict, epic fail. So imagine a series of circulating coins featuring dead presidents. What a concept. So while the Sacagawea dollar had already been dormant, in 2007, the Treasury Department decides they're going to introduce a series of presidential dollars. And 941 million produced in the first year, and then the curiosity wore off. They didn't circulate. They got stuck in the same Treasury pipelines as the Sacagawea dollar. And still the Mint kept producing them to the tune of 2.373 billion by the end of 2011. So the Treasury was becoming desperate. They needed to build more storage space for all these dollars. But in December of 2011, Treasury Secretary Geithner put a halt to all circulating production of dollars of any type. So during the same 5 years, that's not 2011 to 2011, that's 2007 to 2011, 15.136 billion $1 Federal Reserve notes were produced. And that's the verdict, epic fail. So another try, now we have Native American dollars. They decided to change the reverse every year of the Sacagawea dollar with a Native American theme. So that was the production in those 3 years, and these were halted along with the presidential dollars. Now you note that during these years, the Federal Reserve note production was only 7.4 billion. So it was down significantly from prior years for two major reasons. We were in the midst of the Great Recession that began in the last third of 2008, and the U.S. was fast becoming a debit card society. Now, let me stress, this is not credit card, it's debit card, okay? So nobody needs coins if you can just swipe your card at Burger King and McDonald's like I do, no matter how small the transaction. You don't need coinage or currency. So this was the biggest thing that changed society, is debit cards. So we talk about seigniorage. Now, the whole point of using a coin, had it been successful, a coin could have lasted 30 years. The original thought that the dollar bill was only going to last 18 months. But what happened with inflation, by 2012, the dollar coin cost 21.1 cents, 2.5 times what it cost in the 70s, and its estimated lifespan, giving its lifespan, it would have cost 0.7 cents per year. However, since dollars don't circulate as intensely as they used to due to inflation, they now last 5.8 years, and they cost 4.9 cents. So their yearly cost is 0.84. So it's really not such a big advantage for a dollar coin. So now we talk about half dollars, starting with the change in 1971 to the fully clad Kennedy half. Had a slightly smaller bust and a wider rim, so it would strike up easier and use less metal in the process. So 1.81 billion were produced in the first 4 years, but of course the hoarding stopped and half dollars stopped circulating. Most of these got used by Las Vegas casinos. And this is the bicentennial half by Seth G. Huntington. And 522 million of these were produced for circulation. Of course, they didn't circulate. Now this is $quarter mintages versus $half mintages of the 25 years following the bicentennial. You know, when we get these state $quarter at the end of to the right, the mintage spiked past $1 billion in face value. Okay, not a billion coins, but $1 billion in face value. And you see how halves just muddled along at the very bottom, not changing at all, regardless of inflation, recessions, whatever went on, halves did hardly moved. And in 2001, the Treasury stopped producing halves for circulation. Now, the half dollar story remained relatively unchanged until 2013. And somewhere between 2001 and 2013, the bust changed. It became smaller again, more crude. In fact, it looked concave. It looks like he had sunken cheeks. In 2014, we were treated to no less than 11 versions of the Kennedy half in 3 different materials. 4 versions were produced with the normal reduced concave obverse. 7 versions in 3 metals were produced with the original 1964 master obverse. And at this point, the master galvano was traced with laser technology, and master hubs were produced using laser engraving. So we no longer had the Janvier reducing machine. It was all computer-aided technology. So the highlight was the 50th anniversary gold half, 3/4 of an ounce, double dated. And for clad coinage, starting in last year, all coinage used the 1964 master. Since they weren't produced for circulation, you didn't need to save die life. You could charge as much as you wanted, use as many dies as necessary, so the circulation strike ones for mint sets and rolls, whatever, use the same master. Now for Washington quarters. Since larger denominations don't circulate it, the dime and the quarter have become the workhorse of commerce. The cent and nickel have been reduced to sales tax status. And this is the bicentennial quarter, the Drummer Boy by Jack L.R. And this is the only one of the 3 bicentennial coins to circulate, and it can still be found occasionally in circulation to the very day. And it is a perfectly proportioned coin. This shows that if the Standing Liberty quarter had been a half size, half bust, it would have worn much better. But that design, as much as we love it, had no business on a 1-inch coin. So this is obverse refinement. 10 different obverse master revisions were done over 33 years. So by the end of 1998, it was a nice looking coin. Same 10 had 6 hub revisions on the reverse. So the feathers were extremely detailed, every single one. So between 1999 and 2009, we had 276 dates, mint marks of state quarters. And each state and territory had a competition. This was the most popular series of all time. The public ate these up. Mintages really spiked. Even though they leveled off later in the series, they were still much higher. So a lot of these were put away in collections. And quality has generally soared since the turn of the 21st century. It's now possible to get Super Gem, MS-68, MS-69 coins in mint sets. A far cry from 20, 30, 40 years ago when the mint sets had some of the most horrendous bag mark coins. That really changed in the last decade or so. So since 2010, we've had the America the Beautiful series. But the general public doesn't know about these. They haven't been publicized as much, and there's no competition. These are produced by U.S. Mint artists, so the work is much better on the average than the state series. But the mintages, again, because of the debit card society and the early ones with the recession, mintages have plummeted. But they're now starting to recover, but they'll never be what they were because of the change in the way commerce occurs. So this is our most successful modern circulating coin. The unit cost was 9 cents. So the seigniorage, the profit per unit, is 16 cents. That's pretty good. Now, the dime has been the other bulwark of circulating coinage, and 170 different dates and mint mark varieties have been produced over the last 50 years. So people can produce a nice collection ignoring the silver coins. And this is the hub evolution. There were 10 hub revisions over the last 50 years. So the devices have been reduced, lettering taken away from the rim, been more simplified. And of course, the overarching thing on all U.S. coinage over the last 50 years is that the relief has been lowered to increase die life. And the unit cost is 3.9 cents. The profit is 6.1 cents. And this is the reverse change over the last 10 years. Now there was, just to let you know, there was no book on this. I actually had to look at photographs of 50 years worth of coins and see where changes occurred. And I actually had documented it, but there was no time in this presentation to show that. And last year we had the first time a commemorative version of the Roosevelt dime with the reverse proof, which became a key to the series, the March of Dimes dime. This is changes to Jefferson nickels. In 1966, the designer's initials were finally added to the nickel. And this had 6 hub revisions over 37 years, just before we had the Westward series. 6 hub revisions for the reverse. So all the details on Monticello were greatly enhanced. And again, the relief was greatly reduced. So we had in 2004 and 2005, the Westward Journey series. And the first 2 years were sort of conservative. First year, were conservative. Then in 2005, we had this new obverse, a 1-year obverse by Don Everhart. And this was a reverse. So for the first time since 1938, we had a Buffalo nickel, even if it was only for half a year. Then in 2006, we had a new obverse and the return to Monticello on the reverse, slightly enhanced hub. So the nickel keeps on in spite of negative seigniorage. The circulating production was 1.2 billion. The cost per unit is 8.1 cents. So the total cost is 97.7 million. So the loss was 37.4 million. This cost has actually gone down because nickel has gone down and production has become more efficient. A few years earlier, this was 10 cents per unit. It's down to 8 cents per unit. So that's one good thing about collapsing commodity prices. So in 1968, the 60-year-old master hub on the Lincoln cent was very muddy, had spread out. So in 1969, we had a major master revision on the 60th anniversary of the coin. In 1982, due to inflation, we had to change the material from 90% bronze, copper, to zinc-plated, copper-plated zinc. And the weight was reduced. So this is what happened between 1969 and 2008. A number of further hub revisions were done. The bust was reduced. It lost detail. It also became concave. And this was the end in 2008 of the memorial reverse. In 2009, we had the Lincoln series, starting with birth and early childhood, formative years, professional life. He spent more than a quarter of a century as a lawyer in circulating around Illinois on the back of a horse or a donkey, sharing bedrooms. There was no such thing as a private motel room in those days. And the presidency. So in 2010, we got the shield reverse, which would have looked great on a 1865 coin. It is really a shame for 2010 coin and beyond. So the cent also lives on in spite of negative seigniorage. Circulating production was 8.1 billion in 2014, and the loss was 57 million for that 1 year. Now this is a chart, just real quick. Coinage production for the penny cent compared to US population. So in 1970, if you look at the far right, it's about 24 cents per person produced that year. Then over the next 3 decades, it averages about 50 cents per person per year for the entire US population. By 2014, it had been reduced to 26 cents per person per year out of 44 years. So how long will clad coins last? Well, silver coins had an estimated production lifespan of 25 to 30 years, and cents and nickels had a lifespan of 30 to 35 years because they were harder material. Has anyone in 50 years ever seen a clad coin less than VF? One person. Really? Okay, I never have. And less than VF. Okay? Likewise, the Lincoln Memorial cent has been around now for over 55 years, and I've never seen one in poor or fine condition, XF and above. That's what most of them are. The value of coins have deteriorated because of inflation, and coins just circulate much less intensely than they did 50, 70, 100 years ago. So the Treasury also recycles worn out coins more aggressively than they used to do. They'll, recycle them. So these are some of my resources, quite a few. Anybody got any questions? Yes, in the back.
I noticed that on the new Roosevelt times, they had this write the date down. It's much harder to read than it used to be, even with glasses.
I guess I haven't noticed that, but I guess that's just a way of making generally the lettering has been reduced in size and also further from the edge. So that's just a way of using less material to increase die life. Every 50, 100,000 coins you can get more out of the die. For any of these circulating denominations, you save, hundreds of thousands per year by producing less dies. That's where the huge part of the cost comes in. And also, since the dies are now produced by computer-aided technology, it just costs less to produce. Anybody else? Next person? Yes.
I'm trying to rattle my memory as best as I can, but what I do remember is in the late 60s, my mother taking me to the bank, giving a paper dollar to the teller, and getting a Morgan dollar. Now, I'm wondering...
That was probably the early 60s. I think you're off by about 5 years. Certainly in 63, 62, no problem. I would say by 66, 7, it didn't happen. In fact, my little story said in 66 or so, my family owned a laundromat. My parents were not collectors, so the story I like to tell is that the 12-year-old son tells the 40-year-old parents to put aside all the silver from the laundromat, and they did, and I slowly traded it off over the next decade and a half for nice coins. The last that I sold at the fun show in 1980 when silver hit $50 an ounce, and I was just laughing. Anybody else?
I got a
Yeah.
comment. As an electrician, I worked up in Delaware in 2006 and 7. We worked for Bank One, and we were building and putting in thousands of credit card processing machines.
Yep.
Which is an indicator to me that the currency is on its way out.
Yeah, and now we pay by phone.
Exactly.
You know, did you ever see that commercial where they says, "Did you install something?" No, I didn't. A boiler in 1978. You know, just is happening. Anybody else? Okay, thanks for coming.